First, we're going to hear from Matthew Carter, who is joining us. We're most grateful to have him joining us from the world of CAFOD and working with refugee populations around the world. And CAFOD is the overseas arm of Caritas, one of Britain's largest international charities. So Matthew, thank you for being here.
Okay, I'm going to talk from the lectern here. Can everybody hear me okay? I'm going to be speaking in English. I'm working from notes, so I hope that'll be easy for the translation. But just before I start, Ewan, I think I need you already. Okay, do people recognise these crosses? These are from Lampedusa, and many of you who know these crosses on a small island off the Italian coast were made by a local carpenter who cut these crosses from a wooden boat that had sunk, bringing Syrian refugees to the shores of Europe. And this is one of the crosses. And I just wanted to hand this around so you could pass it amongst yourselves, because the whole essence of my conversation about refugees is I will talk about vast numbers, but actually we're talking about individuals. And that's what we are about as a Christian community, the individual. And each of these crosses represent individuals who've been lost. And I know many of us in this room today have these crosses within our own places of worship. Refugees, economic migration, internally displaced people, trafficked, homeless, what is meant by these terms, whether living on the streets in London or Nairobi, fleeing Aleppo, being stateless, being kidnapped, sold and trafficked, or being forcibly moved to another part of your own country. Since the summer months of 2015, there has been much talk about the European refugee crisis. We sadly continue to see the images of refugees from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Eritrea, who arrive in rubber boats on the shores of Spain, Greece, and the island of Lampedusa, as in the cross I just have shared with you. And the image of that small boy, Alian Kurdi, the 3-year-old Kurdish Syrian that shook the world, of that young boy lying on the beach, washed up on the beach, dead. The response of member states of the European Union to the world crisis has been slow and patchy over the last 3 years. We still haven't caught up with 80,000 refugees who still remain in transit in Greece. The UK government agreed to take 20,000 refugees by 2020, but to date has not even taken half of that number. This amounts to 0.01% of the UK population. In comparison, as we've seen, since 2015, Germany has taken 1.5 million refugees, which equates to 2% of the German population. 2 in 100 people in Germany are now refugees. The refugee crisis in Europe has brought home the horrors of the global crisis. And it is this global refugee, internally displaced person, and migration crisis that I will be focusing on in my talk today. Globally speaking, we are now witnessing the highest levels of human displacement on record. and the greatest mass movements of people in history. 5.6 million people have fled Syria over the last 7 years. I remember in 1995, I was working in Zaire, as it was then, or Congo, as it is now, witnessing 2 to 3 million people fleeing from Rwanda. And this memory of mass movement of this scale will live with me forever. According to the UN refugees, UNHCR, 6.85 million people, 68.5 million people around the world have been forced to leave their homes in 2017. Among 40 million people are displaced within their own countries, and half of these numbers we're talking about are children. Now, if we look at if we look at where most of the world's refugees and IDPs live, we realise that a striking 85% are being hosted in developing countries or in the north. Countries like Turkey, Lebanon, Turkey's hosting, for example, 3.5 million refugees. And then there's Uganda, Pakistan, Lebanon, and Iran. As we will see throughout this presentation, protection, and the word protection is how to ensure the safety and dignity of individuals, is becoming an issue both in refugee and internally displaced camps and within host communities. The greatest threats to refugees originate from the likes of organised crime, trafficking, transport, travel, health, etc. To protect people to protect the people we work with, we have to find ways to mitigate against those risks. But how do we do that? How do we incorporate protection principles into our work? How do we ensure that those we support receive the assistance that they need? For example, access to water, food, shelter, education, healthcare, community support, etc., in a meaningful and dignified way. The major problem is the size and sheer scale of the situation we are dealing with, and the need to ensure that safety of such vast numbers of people. Over the past 5 years, the international aid sector has had to radically develop and improve its models of working, particularly around these areas of protection and safeguarding for those people without homes due to their increasing vulnerability. The safeguarding and protection of children, vulnerable adults, and all those displaced has become central to our work and has also been highlighted, as you've seen more recently, in the international aid scandals. Human migration is, of course, not a new phenomenon. People have travelled across continents throughout history, some of them voluntarily, and others as a result of armed conflict, violence, natural disasters, extreme poverty, or other forms of hardship. And throughout history, the Catholic Church, like many other religious institutions too, has provided a place of shelter, sanctuary, and comfort for those fleeing war and persecution. The Catholic Church is founded on narratives of migration, and in turn seeks to alleviate the suffering of refugees in accordance with its core values of compassion, hospitality, sanctuary, freedom from oppression and hope, and many more values. Over the past years, Pope Francis has been one of the world's most influential advocates for the rights of refugees and migrants. He has been reminding us that refugees are our brothers and sisters, and that we must all treat them with dignity, love, and respect. An example of this, in September 2017, Pope Francis launched a global campaign to support refugees and migrants, and many of us here, I'm sure, have been involved in this. And it was called Share the Journey. The campaign brought together Catholic organisations, including CAFOD, my organisation, and our sister Caritas agencies across the world. Together we call on everyone to play a part in welcoming and protecting refugees. Over the last 20 years or so, CAFOD spending on programmes supporting refugees and internally displaced migrants has increased dramatically. In the financial year of 17-18, CAFOD spent 21.4 million on emergency response programmes, including in Bangladesh 1 million, which targeted 80,000 people, Europe, the European refugee crisis, 1.2 million for 30,000 people, and in Syria, 6.7 million for 60,000 people. But as we see, although these funds are vast, they are still just a drop in the ocean. In 2018, the network of Catholic Church agencies under the banner of Caritas International mobilised $230 million for the Syrian refugee crisis, which has allowed us to reach 3.9 million people. Caritas International, for those of you who are not aware, is a group of 170 national members, CAFOD being one of those for England and Wales. Caritas is also the second largest global NGO after the International Red Cross. I'm just going to present a few short case studies now, if you could bear with me. Darfur, I hear you say, oh, Darfur, didn't that happen a long time ago? And I'll come back to that in a minute. Darfur region in Sudan has been the scene of major armed conflict since 2003. For 15 years now, there's been constant fighting between the Sudanese army, opposition groups, militia and ethnic groups. The conflict has killed hundreds of thousands of men, women and children and has driven over 2.5 million people from their homes. It is now estimated that 7.1 million people in Sudan are in need of humanitarian assistance, which includes the people of Darfur. I remember in 2003 sitting at with CAFOD's senior management team discussing Darfur, a region that CAFOD and the Catholic Church had worked very little in and had a very small presence. We'd been asked by the Catholic community, the Catholic Church in Sudan and the Anglican Church, who both came to us together to say, could we launch a response? I remember saying to my director at that time, Chris Bain, Chris, I think we'll be out within a year. I think this will be a quick response. 15 years on, we are still there. And the church is still there, and the church continues to be probably one of the most visible and active players where much of the international community has left. So how wrong I was 15 years ago. In opening 10 years, the budget was around $18 million per year, a team of 40 international staff and nearly 2,000 national staff. The Darfur programme highlights what we define as a protracted crisis, which is sadly increasing across the globe. Other examples of protracted crises would be places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, OPT, South Sudan, Congo, Colombia, etc. To respond to the needs of Darfur, CAFOD has been contributing for 15 years now. The programme is based in South and Central Darfur and focuses in areas of water and sanitation, education, health, nutrition, emergency preparedness, food security, and economic empowerment. I think the real startling thing about the size of and what I'm trying to convey is the size of 2.5 million people being displaced. This is the size of Chicago or Nairobi suddenly being moved into a piece of desert where they've never inhabited before. I mean, it's just madness. and then you're having to provide services in an extremely difficult and vulnerable situation. Here you can see one of the health and education classes we were running for women and men in Hassa Hissa IDP camp, which is the overall camp is divided down into smaller camps, and this one camp hosts 60,000 people. Moving on to Bangladesh, which is closer and more in terms of more recent history. Since August 2017, more than 900,000 Rohingya have fled Myanmar, as we've seen on our news and TV, to escape a campaign of violence against them by the Myanmar army. The vast majority of these reaching Bangladesh were women and children, and more than 40% are under the age of 12. 40% under the age of 12, which is terrifying, of how you provide the protection and support for that number of children. And then a huge proportion were the elderly. Most of them live in makeshift refugee camps, and the needs are immense. Food, access to just providing safe water for that number of people is really, really difficult, as you can imagine. But most importantly, as I've touched on, the protection of those vulnerable groups and providing them with a level of shelter. I visited Rohingya twice this year, and in this place you can see homelessness at its most extreme. 900,000 people living on a parched and dusty piece of land, 700 square kilometres. 700 square kilometres. I mean, that in itself is also staggering. 900,000 people, to give you a picture of that, is the size of the capital of Colombo in Sri Lanka. But that's not placed on 700 square metres. Or it's like 5 times the size of Geneva. My image of this place, and as you can see, it was like an apocalyptic film. An undulating terrain with bamboo houses, shelters in every direction. Everything had been painted with a coating of brown dust, adding to the image. The heat of 40 degrees was overwhelming, with not a tree in sight, and people trying to take shelter under a piece of plastic sheeting. I've worked in really hot countries, and even the midday sun, when it came out, I didn't know how people were coping. And the real frightening thing about this statistic is we think, oh, well, they'll go home. The statistics are the average refugee is 20 years old before they ever find a stable home or a place to go to. So these camps we see like this will run, I estimate, for many, many years to come. The Rohingya are not accepted in Myanmar. They are not recognised in Bangladesh. And as we've been discussing here, they are then what? Stateless. The worst place to be. In this type of environment, threats to their safety, children and vulnerable adults increase. As we've heard on the news, trafficking, abuse and prostitution is a growing problem within the camps at an alarming rate. Imagine 900,000 people with no legal system at all. Imagine 900,000 people dumped in a space where there is no judiciary, no police force, no health service, etc., etc. And it's a living nightmare for those people who've already come from a nightmare. We've talked over the last 2 days about collaboration, and I'll be highlighting a number of forms of collaboration. The UK brought together an organisation called the Disasters Emergency Committee, which brings together the 14 large UK agencies. And it's a phenomenal tool because it's one voice speaking to the UK public, and it gives clarity, meaning, purpose and simplicity in that message when you have a major disaster. It subsequently raised £30 million for the Rohingya. Given the high percentage of vulnerable people living in the camps and the need to ensure a protected environment for women, girls and children, small programs become really, really critical. So in this image here you see of women who've been given lamps through the Caritas and Catholic Church program and locks so they can lock the door of their very makeshift houses and shelters. The lady in the middle of the picture, Hassana, 50 years old, she shows us an array of tools that she's been using to improve her own shelter. She said, "I've never used tools before, but Caritas people showed us what to do. When we first tried, the rain came through. Then we corrected our mistakes that I was really proud of. And the last night when it rained, the shelter stood up and did not leak. I feel very proud. And now we will see how we can cope when the rains increase." Yesterday, my colleague Rana from Lebanon spoke to the situation of thousands of Syrian refugees living in camps across Lebanon. I'm just touching briefly on Syria because Syria today remains the most complicated and major crisis we're dealing with, because of how it ripples out across the Middle East. 500,000 people have been killed. 5.6 million Syrians have left their country. 17 million remain in Syria with very little hope or systems in place. 6.6 million people have lost their homes. 13.6 million, including 5 million children, are in need of assistance. And these figures are just staggering. And again, regionally, Lebanon, 1.8 million refugees, Jordan, 700,000, Turkey, 3.5 million, Iraq, 300,000, Egypt, 130,000. And again, this is individual people. As I started off by saying, sending that cross round, these figures, and in our own work, are just staggering. Again, collaboration, CAFOD working with SCIAF, our Caritas sister agency in Scotland, finding ways of collaborating and sharing tools and resources and funding. And in Syria, a program of Hassan, who has collected some bread from Caritas Syria support in eastern Aleppo. And images that we're all used to from Lebanon. And then Yemen, which I'm not going to talk about, which is at the top of all our lists, and another crisis in the making already being made. So to finish off on, there are a number of emerging challenges. There are a number of people in need are increasing. Increasing complexity and protraction of a refugee crisis, increasing, as I've talked about, protection needs. The major problem is the size and the scale of the situation and the need to ensure the safety of such large numbers of people. Cuts in government funding, and particularly for us being a UK agency, losing the access to EU funding. Last year, for example, CAFOD received £7 million from the European Union, and we don't know where that funding will come from next year. And then just to move on, as we're running out of time, we need to continue to ensure that the link between humanitarian and development assistance is maintained. You can't have one without the other. You cannot just provide emergency welfare assistance and no long-term development. The need to improve collaborative models of working and working in local partnership and building long-term community-based solutions. and then looking at the issue of protection, as I've touched on throughout my talk. And my last concluding image is an image that I took in South Sudan late last year. The refugee crisis and global homelessness continues to escalate at a staggering rate. The figures I've presented to you today are staggering and call for action. We have to continuously lobby our governments and the UN to address these needs. It is our collective capacity which will bring about the greatest change. Can, for example, the homelessness sector, yourselves, and the international sector work more closely? And what's been really heartwarming of coming here today is just seeing we're talking the same language, but can we work more closely together and deal with a major international challenge? Thank you very much.